Stone Go! Welcome everybody to our first segment of History Speaks. My name is Jake Tiger. I'm accompanied here with Rodney Factor, and today we'll be talking about our beginnings in the Seminole Nation. Rodney, tell us about yourself. What band do you belong to?
Stone Go. I belong to a Tusago Harjo band, which comes from the Oconee tribe
Okay.
of Seminoles.
This is Rodney Factor. He's a very knowledgeable man. He knows what he's talking about. So, Rodney, I'm going to pick your brains a little bit today. So we talk about our beginnings as Seminole people, and it doesn't just begin in the 1800s. It goes a little bit before that. Would you mind talking about the origins of the Seminole people?
Well, to me, the story of the East Seminole is a story of resistance, removal, and renewal from history. From early explorers had identified a number of small tribes or different sized tribes that lived along the borders of Georgia, Florida, and all throughout the southeast. They were numerous in number. The principal languages, I understand, was Muskogee and Hijiti, along with Yuchi and some of the others, Miccosukee. But as early explorers came into Florida in around 1513, and started that expansion north, and later Europeans came in along that Atlantic coast, and they were starting to make inwards into the lands and encroaching upon the tribes there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there was a lot of conflict, and the tribes resisted, and at that time they were associated with the Muskogee Creeks in what they considered the early historians as a confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And those tribes, to my understanding and what I've read and studied, is that they were related by fire. That fire, was an important thing to them, And as the encroachment continued, some of the tribes started to move down into Florida. There were raids down there into Florida, and with Oglethorpe from Georgia, and some of the other tribes, started going into that area. There was some wars, and skirmishes. Of course, Spaniards were in Florida, and they had offered some of the tribes what was referred to as lower creeks to start occupying some of those lands that were left vacant because of war and disease. Once the Spaniards arrived in Florida, there was a number of tribes existing there in Florida, and I understand they were still in the stages of mound building. And of course, that was interrupted, and it was like a tsunami, I guess, that we could refer to as spreading across the land with disease, and pestilence and warfare, and the people were ravaged, And, anyway, there was a lot of land that was vacant because of some of those things, and so some of the tribes that were in the north started to move into those areas. I understand Appalachia in that area with the Tallahassees, and then sometime after that, Oconees came down from north central Georgia and occupied that part that they refer to as Olajoa, around Gainesville today. But they started cattle raising, farming, raising crops. And there was some skirmishes with the tribes there, and I think some of those tribes are decimated by those plagues, merged with those that were coming in, and of course their numbers started to increase. There was a time when they had peace. There was a certain amount of peace. They raised crops, a number of different crops to feed their people. They had huge herds of cattle and hogs, and like I said, Bartram, I think, reported that, he saw fields as big as 20 miles long of corn,
Mm-hmm.
And the people, of course, all worked together. in that time period. And as Europeans continued to encroach in the Americas and came into that area, then they coveted that land that the Seminoles were on at that time. And there were some runaway slaves that came into Florida also, and they were acquainted with the Seminoles, in different aspects. Slavery, existed at that time. And so a lot of those people claimed that their slaves had came into Florida, and they were, coming in and raiding camps and stuff, killing people, stealing horses and cattle, and those kind of things. And it prompted the first Seminole War. They said that, they were in search of slaves, and of course Andrew Jackson had his own motives, for coming in. He didn't care for the Spaniards, and some of the tribes didn't either. But anyway, that's prompted the first Seminole War. He came in and he burned some major villages, the Oconees in that Alakjoa area. One of their top chiefs, was killed, wounded, and later died. And it started causing a disruption at that time. History says that Seminoles, were starting to advance in different areas of beadwork, silver smithing, and those kind of things, and they were starting to develop, some of their arts, and they were interrupted by the wars, and so they had to become vigilant at that time. There was encroachment, and from the militia out of Georgia, and just groups of Europeans, the white farmers and stuff, that came in and would take from them, would claim property. If there were slaves involved, they said it was theirs. And of course, the native people had no avenues to the courts, but they used the courts, and even at that time, one of our strong resistors, Jumper, in a treaty talk, made reference to that these seems like these laws are made for you and not for us. But that prompted a lot of controversy at that time, and the federal government, of course, coveted the land for those people, that were coming in. Their populations continued to grow, and so they were the Congress, or decision makers at that time were encouraged by these people to find a way to get rid of the native people. And so that, was starting to lead up to the Second Seminole War. But there was a treaty, we go back to that, there was a treaty in 1823 called Moultrie Creek.
Moultrie Creek, yes.
It was Florida Territory in 1823. And of course at that time they referred to the tribes in Florida. And that treaty created a reservation in Florida. What the federal government, or mostly the Army, wanted to do was to restrict movement, of the Seminoles. They cut off their connection to the coast, where there couldn't be trade with Cuba and some of the other surrounding islands, that they had normally did trade with, and so what they were looking for at that time was to put them mostly in the center of Florida there on a reserve, and so the chiefs did agree to those terms at that time in 1823. That was the first time that the tribes had came together, and they selected a leader, to speak in their behalf, and anyway, that leader was supposed to relay, their wishes, and their decisions, and so that happened, and the tribes, and there was a separate treaty made about that same time, Apalachicola Band in 1832. That was just recognizing a reservation for them, in that part.
So when you refer to the Seminoles, you said they're appointing a chief. When we talk about Seminoles, they're not a tribe they're a nation of small tribes banded together.
Right.
Correct.
I think, I read in the first time that the term Seminole was used was in 1771 by a British agent, in a conference that was taking place, and he made reference to that Alakjua area, the Oconees. Those were the ones that were first identified as Seminoles.
Yeah.
Of course, I think the term was used before that, but in official papers it was referred to that. And then after that, all the tribes in Florida became known as Seminoles. And because they were all distinct different tribes, then they elected a spokesperson, to speak in their behalf. And of course, that person had no more authority over them, any kind of authority over them except to deliver what they had said.
Of course.
In discussion with the federal agents. And so that's kind of where that term Seminole came from. They say that it's a Spanish word, cimarroni, and they said it meant wild or separated,
In Spanish language, right?
Right. And then, Muskogee, where they said there's no R, sounding, and it was interpreted, say, Seminole, and Seminole today, But, there were a number of different tribes that had came together at Moultrie Creek, and like I said, before they got there, I understand, 5 miles or something like that before they reached the treaty grounds, and they did stop and gather, and they elected a spokesperson to speak in their behalf. And that was the first time that, they had come together to that point to do that, to elect someone like that, a spokesperson. And so that's where that came from, as to what we refer to as a Miko or chief today.
Yes.
And like a spokesperson, for the nation. But anyway, that there was that treaty put us in the center of Florida, and later they found that the lands were not suitable for growing the kind of foods that they were accustomed to eating. A lot of the game, were killed off and stuff, and a lot of deer, and they subsisted on bear. A lot of the wild plants, berries and different things like that they were used to supplement their diets, those things wasn't there. And basically they were starving. And the government, during their treaty talks had, said that they would provide them with annuities, foods and like that. And they didn't do it. So some of the young men, of course, went outside of the designated areas of the reserves and was hunting, and I think were accused of killing some cattle, and some of those things. And so there was a huge outcry, from, they wanted that land too, those that were moved into Florida. So they started saying declarations were caused by the natives there, that something needed to be done with them. They needed to, be forced out of that area to the west, through war or extermination, as whatever it took. And they did develop that policy of extermination. They wanted our people wiped off the face of the earth. So for simply wanting to live free, without any interference, their identity was, one of the most important things to them, as to who they were, or, who they believed themselves to be at that time, and their right to self-govern themselves without any side interference. And that's what our people have held true in their hearts all the way till now, But that started the conflict there. And, of course, and then after that, they sent a group to Oklahoma Territory, and that would have been around 1833. There was a treaty drafted and signed at Fort Gibson in 1833 with some confidential chiefs that went to look at the land, to see if it was suitable for them, and they were to come bring that information back to the main body and decide, if they would, relocate or if they were, would continue to resist.
Mm-hmm.
And those chiefs, they say that they didn't sign that treaty, or it was under duress, but it was signed nevertheless,
Mm-hmm.
And so the government told them that you're going to have to move, and the Moultrie Treaty had given them, like 20 years, and they said, we're not going to consider it until that 20 years is up,
Mm-hmm.
And the government, of course, said, no, we're going to give you a certain amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
and you're going to have to move. So our people prepared for war.
Mm-hmm.
And
So that kind of takes us into what we call the Second Seminole War.
right, yes, and of course that started, around 1835,
Mm-hmm.
and
With the Dade's Battle.
Dade's Battle, and that Wally Thompson, being killed for his disrespect, to our chiefs, at that
Mm-hmm.
time, and it was one of the most longest and costly wars, that the United States had fought, with Native people, and it was that resistance, and that
Mm-hmm.
guerrilla warfare, that they started bringing out, and of course they went into the swamps, and it was a running battle for those many years. A lot of our people were killed, women and children were killed, from militia, from the armies, and their main goal was to force our people to come west, and as they captured them, then they would hold them in different forts and stuff until they gathered numbers or put them out on a ship, and once they got a number that they were waiting to reach, then
Mm-hmm.
they start bringing them west, and they were brought as prisoners of war.
Mm-hmm.
The warriors, I understand, were shackled, they used, when they were able to capture chiefs, then they threatened to hang them, if their people didn't come in, and they wasn't allowed to really gather any of their possessions
Mm-hmm.
to take with them, once they were captured in the field. And
stuff like that happened in Kawakuji. They would basically tell his people, or tell him if they don't sign, they're going to kill his family. So stuff like that kind of happened
right,
to people like Kawakuji, and Osceola was captured under a flag of truce.
right. When Osceola, yes, was he had been brought in, or he was, there was somebody had come and talked to him about coming in and guaranteed, his freedom. He'd come in and talk, and you can go, and that was his understanding. And he came in, and of course he was captured under flag of truce about that same time. Miganuppa and I think there was 5 or 6 sub-chiefs that came in too at a different place, and they were guaranteed, the freedom, to leave, when they wanted to, and that their safety would be secured. And they came in and were talking, about the truce, and there was a disagreement, I understand, and they were all placed under arrest, and they were held, for a certain period in 1837, in 1838, then they were brought west as prisoners of war. And so that's what happened, is that, a lot of them were deceived, into coming in to talk. Some were weary of war, of course, and they came in and they were captured, or they would capture a chief like that, and if the people didn't come in, then, they threatened to kill them, and they, that's kind of what happened,
So that kind of goes into our removal process. You had talked about the Fort Gibson Treaty.
Right.
There's also another treaty that entitles to us too, is the Treaty of Payne's Landing.
Yeah.
Those are two crucial treaties that were brought on us part of our removal process.
Yeah, Payne's Landing was 1832, and but when the federal government recognized the tribes as a sovereign, that's one thing that we always have to remember is that, we are a sovereign people. The federal government recognized that whenever they created their government. Our government existed before their government did. And and they started treaty making, because they looked at us as equal. I say equal at that time, is our power, our resistance. We could have brought a lot more people in. There could have been a long, costly war, if our people united. And so that's what they were looking at as, really that tactic of divide and conquer. But the Seminoles entered into that treaty in 1832. There was in that treaty provided for a delegation of Seminole chiefs to travel to Creek Land in present-day Oklahoma to examine the character of that land and the favorable disposition of Creeks to reunite with the Seminole as one people. And so, like I had said a while ago, that's when they came to Fort Gibson, and that was 1834. And the first treaty between the U.S. and the Seminole people that grants land to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma, for Seminole peoples agreeing to remove from Florida. This treaty resulted when the Seminole delegation sent to Creek Territory found the land satisfactory, thus making the Treaty of Payne's Landing binding and requiring the Seminole people to immigrate from Florida. The treaty designates and assigns to Seminole tribe of Indians for their separate future residence forever a tract of country lying between the Canadian rivers and the North Fork thereof, and extending west to where a line running north and south between the main Canadian and the North Branch will strike the forks of the Little River, provided said west line does not extend more than 25 miles west of the mouth of the said Little River. The land granted to the Seminoles in this treaty was carved out of lands held by Creek peoples pursuant to the treaty with the Creeks at Fort Gibson, February 1833.
So when we talk about the treaties when they signed, they were put on ships and moved different places during the what we call the Trail of Tears.
Correct.
Starting from, they were put on a little small island called Egmont Key, and they were put on basically ships, just packed in there like sardines, and moved up to New Orleans, to Fort Pike and Jackson Barracks.
Right.
And a lot of times they'd have to go either up the rivers or just walk themselves to Fort Smith, Arkansas. There was another stopping point right there. And some of them were brought on ships too, down the Verdigris, Illinois, and Arkansas River, down to Fort Gibson.
Right.
So that takes us to Fort Gibson here in present-day Oklahoma. Can you just summarize how long we were there?
Yeah.
How long the Seminole people were placed at Fort Gibson?
Okay. They well, like I said, they came in different numbers. I think that 1838 group, there was over 1,000, and they said that was the biggest or the largest removed from Florida, at one time. And I think a lot of them came into Louisiana, like you said, at Fort Pike, and they were held there for a time, and there was others that arrived, and they started moving them up the Arkansas, or the Mississippi up to the Arkansas to Fort Gibson. And once they arrived there and disembarked, then the agreement that they understood, that there would be land that's set aside for them, specifically set aside for them. And that wasn't the case. There were Creeks that were living on that designated land, and so the federal government said, well, go ahead, just, merge with the Creeks, basically, and the leadership at that time, they refused to, because of their own identity, and they said that, we're not merging with them, we're not Creeks, we're Seminoles, and they stood fast on that. The federal government, tried to force them by withholding annuities, rations, to them. The people were starving, and of course the winters were harsh here in Oklahoma. And times, they were freezing, but they held fast to their identity as to who they were. That went on they were in a Cherokee country, and the Cherokees at first had agreed to, let them stay there until, those differences were worked out, and land suitable for them to could be obtained. And so they did, and as more came in, then of course, it became a bigger population, and they said that, they were, butchering some of the cattle, and I think some of the Cherokees started protesting, to their government, that, it's time for them to go, and of course they continued to resist, the merging with the Creeks and giving up their own identity, as a free people.
There was a lot that went on during at that time at Fort Gibson. For instance, the International or the Indian Treaty Council of 1843 that was held by John Ross, and all of the tribes were invited out there. Where all those, there's still about 20 tribes out there, or nations, were invited. It was the first time a lot of those tribes were brought together and were able to discuss diplomacy. That was one of the many great things that has been seen out there at Fort Gibson. When we talk about Seminole sovereignty and becoming identified as our own people, of course, you were one of the first original organizers of the Independence Day celebration. And when we talk about the 1856 Treaty of August 7th, can you just elaborate on that real quick?
Okay, well, right before that, 1856, there was 1845, and that was, again, land designated specifically for Seminoles, and some of them moved, into those areas at that time, not too far from Fort Gibson, and they started living in those areas, but they still maintained that they didn't want to come under Creek domain, and so with letters written, from different leaders, then that led to the 1856 Treaty. Continued to insist that they have a separate land for themselves, and a land where they could practice their customs, their traditions, carry on self-governance, for their people. And eventually they did win out, and so there was a land that was set aside for them, or that they purchased from the Creeks in a western domain between the North and South Canadian River, that extended almost to the Texas line at that time. And they started to move into that area in 1857, 1858, because there was crop failure, and those kind of things, but they started slowly moving into that area where they, were recognized, as they're having their own government in the West. Of course, to them, from time, since they've known, that they had a right to govern themselves, and I say that, in the West, and with the federal government, then the federal government did recognize them as a separate people after that 1856 treaty, and they recognized them as a separate people and the right to govern themselves. It spells it out in a treaty that they have a right to self-governance without any outside interference, and that's what they wanted.
So kind of touch on a little bit more of the 1856 treaty. That gave us our own council house, light horse police, no interference from any other government organization.
Right.
Those are some of the key points in the 1856 treaty.
They had, whenever after the 1845, that treaty, they moved into that Little River area, or the North Fork area, then they built the roundhouse. They said that was the first thing they did, was built the roundhouse, and started developing a council that they had started before leaving Florida. And they were recognized, like I said, with pretty much, where they were, they refused to seat on a Creek council, because they said that, they wasn't listened to anyway, but they, continued, their own form of government at that time. And so they did have a working relationship with one another. There was probably over 20 some tribes at that time, that we consider bands today, that existed at that time. And of course, over the years, they slowly started merging. The smaller ones started merging into, their relatives, their band, with the, that were larger. Some of them had separated in Florida because of the war or because of their size. They got too big, and one branched off, and developed another Talova, another town, and so they came back together, and they started that move at that time, after 1856, and they started bringing that government back together, and of course the tribes, the bands, they had free choice, and so most of them agreed, that to work, with the council, where each one would be represented, by their Miko, their chief, and a couple of his helpers, Tustanuggies, Then, they started in the process of governing themselves, in that area.
So at the time, we talked about, there's a photo of a delegation, I believe it's from 1852. So the whole process of the 1856 treaty, it was a lot of back and forth, a lot of traveling. They'd send Billy Bullocks back and forth to, he would come here and they had to go back to Florida to convince some people to come back here.
Right.
Another prominent figure was John Jumper.
Right.
They said he was the principal chief of the time of the nation.
Yeah, I think Micanopah, that was the chief that came, brought, the people west. I think he died in
It was 1848.
48, yeah. And it was in the winter, so there's always a question, was it December 1847 or 1848, but nevertheless, he did die at that time, and the way they went through, it was hereditary, and they said that his nephew named Jim Jumper became chief, and for a time, and he died, and John Jumper became chief,
Yeah.
But during that same time, Kawakaji, the one they call Wildcat, had came west, and he was a real staunch supporter of the Seminoles having their own government, their own land, and he had written letters to Washington, to D.C. to that aspect, and he became weary at that time, because a lot of it had to do with slaves, and he ended up, taking a group to Mexico, to get away from, the pressures, that was taking place at that time, and to perhaps develop a new colony there, for his people, to get away from the federal government and get away from the tribes, that were surrounding us, that were having conflicts, Creeks, and he just wanted to get away, So, yeah.
So we had talked about conflict, and we're talking about, this prosperous time that we actually are referred to as Seminole, and we have our own identity because of the 1856 treaty. But shortly after, we were kind of sandwiched in between both sides of the Civil War. The Seminoles fighting on both sides.
Right. That well, like you said, they started that move, in 1857 and 1858, and of course that conflict, concerning the Civil War, started in 1860, 1861, and during that time, then the treaty that was made, the 1856 treaty that was made with the federal government, the government assured, our tribes at that time that, if you retain the peace, and moved to these lands, then we'll do certain things. One of those things is to protect you. To so you don't have to go to war. We don't want you fighting with other tribes or fighting with us, and we'll protect you. And we'll provide you annuities. So that you can have subsistence. Help you get started. With your crops and those kind of things. But most of all was protection. And so whenever the Civil War broke out, then Fort Gibson and some of these other forts that were around at that time, they abandoned those forts and went north into Kansas. And our leadership at that time, from history says that they wanted to remain neutral and pretty much, stay out of that. And they sent, messages to the federal government in Kansas and stuff, and asked, what are we supposed to do? Your treaties guaranteed us that, you were going to look out for our interests, our protection here. And they didn't respond. They had cut their annuities off, and they were surrounded pretty much by the federal Confederate troops. And, of course, they were looking out for their survival, and Albert Pike at that time, was well acquainted with Seminoles. He had served as an agent for the Seminoles, and he encouraged and talked some of the band chiefs into signing a treaty with the Confederate that was probably the most lucrative treaty that we had signed as Seminoles to date, to that date, and where it gave them, they guaranteed them pretty much for the United States. It said, that they were going to have, the right to self-government, and that they would even create a seat in their Congress,
Yes.
And, for their recognition. And they made a lot of promises, to, their lands and stuff. And so, like I said, they felt abandoned, that our treaty, our 1856 treaty had been abrogated, by the federal government at that time. And like I said, for their own protection, there was 12 or so bands at that time signed with the Confederate Army.
Yeah, because at the time they said the Confederates, they told the Seminoles that they'd be protected because they felt crossed by the United States government.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were kind of put under the regiment of Stan Wadey, the Cherokee general at the time.
Right.
So the one battle that they call the Gettysburg of the West, Honey Springs, Seminoles fought on both sides. Some of the Seminoles that fought in the Union were under Obothiolas, under his with his people,
right.
And we had the Seminoles fighting with the Confederates.
Yeah.
And also like another battle, Round Mountain.
Yeah.
So there's it's kind of like a weird kind of divide where people were just kind of torn. They had, coming from the whole Seminole Wars and the removal and our treatment at Fort Gibson, and then having to transition into the Civil War. For I would say, over half a century, the Seminoles were never even seen, just peace. They were, just destitute and.
Well, that's true. I think that from some of those tribes or bands that went north, they were some of the ones that came later. Some of the early ones that came there, mostly they sided with the South. And a lot of them were, they were relatives. They were related to each other, and stuff. And of course, that battle of Round Mountain, then they were attacked. Those that were headed north, they were considered, Lowell Seminoles, and they were attacked in fighting skirmishes all the way to Kansas, in the snow and everything, so our people suffered because of that Civil War. They suffered on both sides, the North first, those that went north suffered first, and later those that stayed, they suffered also, when they were driven from their homes, but that was two armies, that were fighting, and we just happened to get caught in the middle of it, and like I said, our Mikos, they try to look for the best solution, for their people, and those are the options that they had, and they made that choice.
So after all the fighting's done, so our numbers have been just downgraded because so many our men were, killed in battle, or our villages were burned. So now we're in the Reconstruction period, where we started coming down to what we say, present day Wowoka and the surrounding areas. Can you
Well, because of the wars, there was at the end of the Civil War, and then there was a peace conference that took place in Fort Smith, I think it was,
mm-hmm.
and there was those different tribes, that had fought for the North and different ones that fought for the South, and of course with agents of the federal government, met there, and those that had fought for the South were around the Wichita River,
Mm-hmm.
In southeastern Oklahoma, and they were having a difficult time coming because of rains and stuff. Rivers, were flooded, and they were a couple of days late. And there was an agreement signed by the northern Seminoles, and that led up to the 1866 treaty. And whenever the southern delegation arrived, then they agreed to most of those terms too, and signed, and then they realized, what those terms spelled out, and they requested that, there be two of those things that, they wasn't agreeing to.
Mm-hmm.
One, they wasn't agreeing to freedmen becoming full members, within the Seminole Nation, and the other was where it was talked about, tribes having our separate state,
Mm-hmm.
at that time, and they didn't say they were opposed to it, but they said they wanted basically more information on it,
Yes.
and so that caused a little division there,
Mm-hmm.
and the treaty was to try to, bring the tribes together, for Reconstruction, like the Seminoles, the North and South, some of the other tribes, the Creeks, they had, fought in different, sides, and so had the other tribes,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and anyway, that's what led up to the 1866 treaty.
It led to the 1866 treaty, and that's going to. So after that period, we kind of see, the building process. People moving down here where we are at present day in the surrounding Seminole County areas, and this is going to take us to the Dawes Commission in the 1890s. Could you just give us a little bit of details on that? What the allotments and.
Well, one of the treaty stipulations was that the Seminoles cede all of that land that they had purchased in 1856 from the Creeks,
Mm-hmm.
that and this other land that we're in today, then this was purchased from the Creeks,
Mm-hmm.
in the treaty 1866 that they agreed, to cede that land, even though the treaties wasn't done away with, but that was punishment, from these agents to the tribes at that time,
Mm-hmm.
for siding with the federal government or the Confederate government. But we have to keep in mind that their whole objective throughout everything when they first came was to strip us of any land, and this was another way of doing that, because they wasn't looking at things that were going on just right then. They were looking far down the road, as to how can we acquire this land,
Mm-hmm.
take this land from them. And so that's what they did, and they said that if we cede that other western lands that we had and settled here, those lands were going to be used for other tribes in freedmen. Our treaty says that, that's what the land was, being ceded for,
Mm-hmm.
And of course, our people were pretty much coerced, into these treaties.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't that, they just, all readily agreed to them. That there was a lot of coercion, that took place, and of course they looked out for the safety of their members. And most of the times they had been coming out of wars, and
Mm-hmm.
their people were weary, and their children, they looked out for their interests. They'd been starving, and they had went through major difficulties, you know, and they were just trying to secure peace, you know. But the main thing that they always maintained was the right to govern themselves, you know. And if not, then they were prepared to die.
Yeah.
You know, they were prepared to go to war, you know. And so, yeah, and after, you know, even whenever they set up in Fort Smith, you know, where they set up a court, you know, there, and the tribes were notified at one point, you know, that federal marshals would come into Oklahoma, to Indian Territory, you know, and arrest people, you know. Then the Seminoles, even at that time, you know, told them that if you come into our country to arrest any of our people without the express consent of our council, then we're prepared to go to war. You know, and that's how much they looked after their people at that time, even though they had, you know, been at war with the United States through the Civil War, and they knew their might, you know, and of course, you know, their harshness, you know, still yet, you know, they were prepared to go to war, you know, for their people, you know, and that's, you know, where that resistance comes from, you know, today, you know.
Well, that concludes today's part of the history part. So we're going to go into the 20th century tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the statehood, our Constitution, and McGirt decision and today's government affairs. So right now we're going to transition into so the only thing we're going to carry into our Q&A part. Ron, I'm just going to let you just pick up where you were left off with right there. You know, what the council, you know, being so resilient.
Yeah, that was during, you know, the Reconstruction. There was a Reconstruction period, you know, and that was after the Civil War. Of course, you know, our people had been separated, you know, the North and the South, and the way Seminole County is now was pretty much Seminole Reservation, you know. And those that came back into Oklahoma, into the Seminole Nation, those fought for the South, North, lived in the northern part of Seminole County, and those that fought for the South lived in the southern part of the county. John Chupko was the chief at that time for the North, and John Jumper was chief of the South, you know. And of course, you know, they started to work together, you know, for the betterment of the people, even though that they had, you know, fought on different sides during the war. You know, they started that reconciliation, you know, because they knew that that was in the best interest of the people, you know. For the people to survive, then they would have to make, you know, some concessions from both sides, you know, and come together, you know, for the betterment of the nation. And there was laws that were written at that time, you know, I guess through interpretation or whatever, you know, as to their, you know, their rules, you know, and each band, you know, we were reduced to 12 bands, you know, at that time, 12 traditional bands. There was laws that, you know, governed them. And after 1866, then there were two other bands that were brought in, were freedmen bands that were recognized as part of the council, you know. The council, the federal government, you know, through that Emancipation Proclamation, you know, didn't know what to do with the freedmen at that time because their laws still didn't govern on, you know, had no power or no authority on our lands, you know, our reservation. They had no authority, and they realized that, and through correspondence, you know, we learned that question, what, you know, came up, what are we going to do with the freedmen, you know? We can't, you know, feed them, you know, we can't give them annuities and stuff at the forts, and they had flocked to the forts, and so they came to a solution that, you know, we'll incorporate them into the tribes, you know. So that was probably the first time, you know, that for us, you know, that there was a civil rights issue, you know. And of course our people agreed to those things, that, yeah, you know, we'll we agree that, they would have civil rights, the same rights as our people, when they live within our reservation boundaries, but they would never be members, of the Seminole Nation. And so that's what brought them in anyway at that time, at the objection of a lot of our people, but still yet, they were brought in and given seats on the council, so that gave us 14 bands at that time.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to take this time, you're one of my primary sources for history and culture. How important do you think you would say for our tribal members to know their history and know their treaty rights, and just how much of a substantial impact that has?
Well, I think, to me, of course, I've always been interested, and had interest in our history, as a people, and where we came from, and the things that we've talked about they barely touch the surface, of our history. But let me read something here, and then this is an Indian Act of 1876. The happiest future of the Indian race is absorption into the general population, and this is the policy of our government. The great forces of intermarriage and education will finally overcome the lingering traces of native customs and traditions. That was said by Duncan Campbell Scott from the Department of Indian Affairs.
Mm-hmm.
But that pretty much is what the federal government, those decision makers had in mind at that time. They wanted us gone, like I said, and when they failed to exterminate us, then they sought another avenue, and that was to assimilate us into the mainstream America. They didn't want our children knowing our language, our customs, our traditions. That's another form of genocide, cultural genocide and language and those kind of things, And so that was an ongoing thing, and today reflects that, because for different reasons, people moved out from this area, the Seminole Nation, and all the other tribes are experiencing the same thing, and they wasn't taught, their customs, their traditions. So a lot of them have an assimilated mind, and there's very few left that really have that Seminole worldview, that look at the world as a Seminole looks at the world, not as, what they were taught, by some others, what they were taught in school and those kind of things, And so now I think it's the most important thing that our people know who they are. That piece of paper, that CDIB card, some of them, that's all that they have that says that, they're descended from a native, But, and I think that they should all, do whatever they can, to educate themselves to what sovereignty is, to start its sovereignty. And there's many words, said, about sovereignty. It's been debated by Congress, by legal scholars, throughout time what sovereignty is. But it boils down to me to one thing, and that's a right to self-govern. And that's what our people have always strived to do, since the becoming of Europeans, their invasion, into our country, And today we have to maintain that, and I think it needs to be taught to our children. And whenever they first came out with the term that I had heard, immersion, through language, then to me, in my mind, it's that those are the ones that can save us. Those little ones that's coming up. If they're taught their language, our language, and they're taught their customs and traditions and those kind of things, then they're going to hold true to that, that identity is going to be there for them. But, that's what it's going to take, But we have to leave them enough, for whenever they are in decision-making positions, and they can take us in that direction.
So I have two questions for you that we have from our Facebook. Charles asks, what factor were the Indian agents, and how the nation was administrated?
Do what?
So here we have. So that's the first one. And that's the second question.
I don't know. That question is, what factor were the Indian agents and how the nation was administrated? Or is that what role they played, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to me, those Indian agents, they had their own agenda. A lot of them were, at different times in our history, during the Reconstruction period, then there was always slaves, came in because, before the Civil War, or even in that time period, when people claimed that, the slaves or the black people that were with the Seminoles, even if they were freedmen, that, they had ownership of them,
Mm-hmm.
until the Emancipation Proclamation and after 1866. But the agents always, they were, some of them were convicted, of selling our food, and giving us rotten food, of shorting the nation, of monies, and annuities, those kind of things. And even whenever our people were coming from Florida to Fort Gibson, then it says that, some of them, couldn't make it up the rivers because they were swollen or for whatever reason and had to walk.
Mm-hmm.
Then some of those towns in Arkansas, Fort Smith and stuff, insisted that they not allow our people to come through their towns, that they had to build roads around them. And they preyed upon them, because the government was buying annuities for them, foods and different things like that to help them, to get to their destination. And they were cheated, and robbed, and they were just barely surviving,
Mm-hmm.
And so those agents were mostly all crooked.
Mm-hmm. And so the second question says, Laura asks, can you elaborate on what the 14 bands are? But no, Mr. Factor. So basically, the 14 bands. Like I said, we had mentioned, the bands were originally tribes in the beginning.
Yeah.
That's what makes us a nation. No, I think that's what that's that question asks, is the 14 bands or originally were the tribes that
Right,
came
like,
together that made the Seminole Nation.
yeah, like I said, there were over 20, like I said, over 20 that were listed as tribes, in the Fort Gibson area,
Mm-hmm.
during that time period, and they merged, with their relative bands, sister bands, mother bands, to 12,
Mm-hmm.
12 traditional bands that we refer to as traditional bands. Actually, they're all tribes. Our 1866 treaty is with tribes. It says the word tribes. It doesn't say bands, or
Mm-hmm.
anything. It says tribes. And therefore, that's why we're known as the Seminole Nation.
Mm-hmm.
Not Seminole tribe, but Seminole Nation, because we consist of tribes that make up this nation.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, the 2 freedmen bands came in and sat on council, so that brought us to 14.
Mm-hmm. And if somebody ever wants to see the original names of the bands, there's a copy of that at the museum in Wolga,
Yeah.
where the names sort of change over the years.
Right. So now we have, like I said, my band, Tusso Harjo, and I came from Oconee. See, we have the Watley,
Mm-hmm.
that's in the south, one of our southern bands, along with Fasuchi,
Mm-hmm.
Tallahassee in that area, Huddy-Oljega, the newcomer band. There's Ojeezes, and Miccosukes, Chiaha, Nutkaparjo, that are surrounding that area.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, Fasuchi, that's a southern band, and let's see, that's 10 of them, and who did I leave out? I did say tall. Eufaula.
Mm-hmm.
Eufaula's, you know, they were identified, you know, clear history, you know, into Florida.
Mm-hmm.
In Hijiti.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's at 12. And then there's a Dozer Barkus in the Bruner,
Mm-hmm.
Bruner band. And
The
most of those bands or tribes can trace their lineage, you know, their history back to Florida
Mm-hmm.
and even into Georgia, you know,
Mm-hmm.
before they moved into the Florida.
Like the Tom Palmer band before they were called the Pascopa band.
Tom Palmer, yeah.
Because Pascopa was our leader at that time.
Right.
That came through, you know, Fort Gibson and fought in the
And
Seminole
those,
Wars.
you know, like I said, some of those bands like Oconee and Miccosukee, Chiaha, they've said, you know, were related, you know, to Hijiti, you know. And some of the others were Muskogee Creek
Mm-hmm.
bands that came down, you know, during after the Red Stick War. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that influx there, you know, helped, you know, to form the nucleus of the Seminole Nation.
Mm-hmm. So is there any more questions for us, Bo? All right. Well, Rodney, thank you for your time for today. We'll pick up tomorrow with part 2 on statehood, the Constitution, and today's current affair, the McGirt versus Oklahoma decision. We'll be here with Rodney Factor again and Chief Chilcote tomorrow. Mado, Rodney.
Well,